So we're going to continue here with Proverbs chapter 13. A wise son hears his father's instruction, but a scorner hears not rebuke. A man shall eat good by the fruit of his mouth, but the soul of the transgressors shall eat violence. He that keeps his mouth keeps his life, but he that opens wide his lips shall have destruction. The soul of the sluggard desires, and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made fat. A righteous man hates lying, but a wicked man is loathsome, and comes to shame. Righteousness keeps him that is upright in the way, but wickedness overthrows the sinner. There is that maketh himself rich, yet has nothing. There is that makes himself poor, yet has great riches. The ransom of a man's life are his riches, but the poor hears not rebuke. The light of the righteous rejoices, but the lamp of the wicked shall be put out. Only by pride comes contention, but with the well advised is wisdom. Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall increase. Hope deferred maketh the heart sick, but when the desire comes, it is a tree of life. Whoso despiseth the word shall be destroyed, but he that feareth the commandment shall be rewarded. The law of the wise is a fountain of life, to depart from the snares of death. Good understanding giveth favor, but the way of transgressors is hard. Every prudent man deals with knowledge, but a fool lays open his folly. A wicked messenger falls into mischief, but a faithful ambassador is health. Poverty and shame shall be to him that refuses instruction, but he that regards reproof shall be honored. The desire accomplished is sweet to the soul, but it is abomination to fools to depart from evil. He that walks with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed. Evil pursues sinners, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Much food is in the tillage of the poor, but there is that is destroyed for want of judgment. He that spares his rod hates his son, but he that loves him chasteneth him betimes. The righteous eateth to satisfying of his soul, but the belly of the wicked shall want. So that is chapter 13. And many of these verses seem relatively straightforward, but as I've said many times, the Proverbs, and that of the proverbial books in general, there are layers to these sorts of things. And while we may find an appropriate analogy, perhaps of our own experience, whether it be an involving us as the individual or an observation of something, of some pattern, there are no shortage of patterns, and there are really no shortage of connections that can be made here. Which is why the Proverbs are an important facet of one's journey in life. They allow one to venture out and to have the experience of a moment in which they can understand something. They connect two pieces together. They can illuminate some pattern in their reality. And so although some of these may seem straightforward and simple, we should not make the mistake that we know exactly what they mean at face value. So we start in verse 1. A wise son hears his father's instruction, but a scorner hears not rebuke. Certainly it's reasonable to hear one's father's instruction. But what of it? Why do we listen? This can apply to the divine Logos just as it can apply to that of the earthly father. But what of the earthly father in this case? The earthly father is a fallen individual. Certainly just because a being is fallen compared to that of the highest Father, it does not mean that there is no truth, that there is no wisdom, but by the same token, there are many situations in which one is raised by a father that makes it quite difficult for one to stand or to tolerate listening to them. The contrarian example is always tempting. The contrarian similar to that of the wicked, but not necessarily wicked per se, wishes to find a hole in some argument. And so a wise son, regardless, I would say, of whether a father's instruction is just or unjust, ought to listen, and they ought to make sense of what he says, just like in the Proverbs. They may not be immediately understandable to us. Our understanding of just or unjust may not be mature enough to take in what we are taking in. But the point is that we must take in information. We must hear it and attend to it. This, in part, is because the Father is in a particular and unique position to guide the Son. Again, whether or not this guidance is in the right direction or not. Certainly, in our ideal situation or scenario, the Father is one that is an upright individual, is a righteous individual. And listening to this person, a son listening to this Father, means that they are going to be walking in his footsteps. They're going to be walking in that righteous path. They're going to be given principles by which they can come to know things, come to understand things. But a scorner hears not rebuke. They are blinded by their disdain, disrespect, their scornful ways, their self-inflated sense. And as such, they are unable to hear correction. And if they are unable to hear correction, they fall further and further into that scorner's pit to become wicked. A man shall eat good by the fruit of his mouth, but the soul of the transgressors shall eat violence. This proverb is addressing speech. It's a particular type of speech. It's good speech. It is speech that is oriented towards the truth. Now, in the agricultural example, that of the fruits, success is fairly easy to see. That is to say, your efforts are successful if you are able and manage to grow something to the fruiting stage of its development. Once you have done so, you now have the opportunity to consume. And so, just as a person takes care to plant his seed in his garden for the future, to have food in the future, that concern and that discerning nature, and that very process of nurturing, of bringing up, and to then consume that which is brought up, applies directly to his dealings with other people. It says, a man shall eat good by the fruit of his mouth. He is speaking in such a way as to be discerning for the future, is to have care for something outside of himself, and the desire to see man move up in his condition, just as a plant grows up into its maturity. And the fruits that are received from this plant, or the fruits that are provided by this speech, is not necessarily to say that we are taking from the plant and we are killing it or damaging it in some way. We are fulfilling a cycle and a process by which man can be sustained. And it just so happens, as we are talking about this process of fruits, in his speech, if he does this in such a way with, again, concern, discernment, care for the future, nourishment, and the desire to see something grow, he shall eat good. Now this speech can be made in any number of different contexts, especially when we're considering that of a city or of a civilization. I'm thinking about an old city. I'm thinking about people that are trading with one another. I'm thinking about families that live next to each other. I'm thinking about communities. I'm thinking about the thing that causes people to maintain some sort of identity, some sort of root and connection to something. And so that thing, the thing that is watered and nourished there, again, in all of these different situations, this process of the plant growing is applied to the situation. The society, the city, the civilization begins to grow up. It is propped up by its constituent elements. Now what emerges from that experience is fruits, is productive families, efficient agriculture, cheap goods, just counselors or just judges. Maintained roads, maintained houses. This is the fruit of the mouth at work. It is speaking truth to the earth so that it may come up, it may rise up. It's speaking truth to somebody that is in the community so that they may rise up. But the soul of the transgressors shall eat violence. Now, of course, to eat violence is going to do damage to the individual. It is to, in a sense, undo him, to destroy him. I mentioned earlier that of identity. Every identity has some boundary around it. I think identity must be of at least a minimum quality in order for it to be something. Otherwise, it's too easily diluted in the rest of possible things that can be characterized that it's not its own thing. And so when I think about transgression, I think about moving beyond a particular identity. That is, to go beyond the bounds of. Now specifically, when we're talking about transgression, we're thinking about going beyond the bounds of a moral principle or some established standard of behavior. But that thing, that moral principle or that standard of behavior, is identifiable. Because otherwise it wouldn't be a principle. Otherwise it wouldn't be a standard. Now if we zoom out a little bit, and we put man into the picture. We put him into the picture in such a way that we recognize his falsehood. Or perhaps a better way to say that is that we recognize his fallen nature, and therefore his susceptibility to identify falsehood, to give some false identity to something. In such a case, perverting that boundary or dissolving that identity would not have an impact on us. It would not bring violence into our soul, nor would it allow us to eat well. I think of this in the context of all of the numerous empires of the ancient world and their continual strivings to try and form some unifying identity, and just how many of them failed versus how many of them were successful. Certainly many more failed than were successful. And we have to attribute this, I attribute this, to that of man's fallen nature, to see a pattern, or to want, or to will something into existence that really ought not to exist. And eventually, the identity doesn't hold, the boundaries are too thin, they are superficial, they are made only by decree that is not grounded in reality. Now within all of the scenarios that I am providing, there's an endless amount of different identities to think about. There's an endless amount of potential false barriers, or barriers that have some true binding potential, but the true potential is inflated by one's own selfishness and egotism, and because of this, people are fooled or tricked into thinking that the boundary is much larger. It is that superficial thing must be held together by force or by violence, otherwise the truth would be known, that it is actually something that cannot sustain some cohesive identity in terms of a strong nation for long. And I say that in part to say because we can imagine, first and foremost, so many scenarios that this type of language would be very difficult, because we're not filtering out just one example out of the multitude. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second is sort of an addendum to what I said earlier about, well, if we make a false identity, then it doesn't mean anything to us. It doesn't harm us in any way. I think that's probably wrong. I think it's very wrong, actually. I think man's freedom of will to produce false identities can be very destructive to himself, and also to the earth. So if we return to our initial analogy, to that of the man that is growing up the things around him, whether it be his children or his crops or his relationships to his neighbors, or to his interaction with his whoever he interacts with on a professional basis. And by this way of life, by this way of behaving, of establishing strong relationships, of understanding the depths of feelings and how they ought to be directed, and what they ought to be aligned to, the one that transgresses this, that is outside of the boundary of that way, outside of the path that is established and set not by man, but by the way of things, then the soul of such a person shall eat violence. And what does it mean to eat violence? We have a non-edible thing that's not even it's not an identity that you can grasp with your hands and pick up and say, aha, this is violence. And it's pairing that to an action that would suggest that it is possible to take that identity and to consume it. And the thing about that is, it is possible to take violence and to eat it. That means to consume it in such a way. And this consuming might be through the digestion of the mind. Now, this may be a rather abrupt break, but this marks a new day and a fresh mind. Well, hopefully a fresh mind, we'll see. And so I was listening to a little bit about what I was talking about before I stopped my recording, about the consuming of violence and its digestion through the mind. And I think it's appropriate to explore, just as we explored how if a man shall eat good by the fruit of his mouth, how that process might look, how it might occur. I think it's only right that we explain in a like manner how the soul of the transgressors shall eat violence. So what can we say of the mouth of the transgressor? The one that breaks through this boundary, but not the malleable boundaries that are set by man, but by the absolute boundaries that are set by the divine, the standard of what is. We could say of the good man, the one that speaks by the fruit of his mouth, the one that tries diligently with discernment, he pursues wisdom, so that this process of growing, and I can't hammer in this enough, this process of growing, just as a seed is planted in the earth, it takes time. It's a very slow process. Much care is needed. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. A lot of things that just aren't known. There's a lot of variables that are outside of our control. But for the good man, he's committed. He's committed to that seed and its well-being. And there are certain things despite the various unknowns that he can do that will increase the likelihood that the seed will mature, and through that process of maturation reach the point at which it will bring forth fruits. Now the transgressor, where does he exist in this process? I suppose it depends on the individual. We talked earlier in the last episode about wickedness and evil, how they are similar and how they're different. We ended on that the evil is an absolute of sorts. It involves intentionality, the freedom of will to do that which is contrary, that which is inherently disruptive for the sake of disruption, to dissolve for the sake of dissolving, with no care and no concern for its reconstitution. And so just like many proverbs, just like many analogies, we can take any path that we want to try and find some reason that illuminates the pattern that the proverb is attempting to shine a light on. And so this transgressor, they may be deceptive. They may plant the seed, and in their planting of the seed, they seem to be as though they are of good quality. They are concerned about the future. Otherwise, they wouldn't plant the seed. Surely it matters what seed that they plant, what fruits they would like to harvest. The expression, "you reap what you sow," comes to mind. And in this way, the evil or the wicked, they cherish and they nourish that which leads to the destruction of the truth. If we stay with this analogy consistently, if we are to say at all of a wicked person, of a wicked fruit, this fruit, by his mouth, is that of lies. His lies, they spin a web of confusion, and again disillusion, without concern for reconstitution. But how does this lead to violence? How does crossing that boundary that is set lead to violence? Well, I have to imagine that it is because of these lies and because of the confusion that leads to an unstable environment that allows this violence to occur. It creates the soil, if you will, for those seeds, the seeds of that violence. We could think of violence, a result, an equivalency to that of a strong emotion. We talk a lot about the misplaced emotions of the heart and how the wicked, they are selfish. They are absorbed within the self, and their actions are limited. They are blinded by that limited sphere that we call the self. And their desires, their passions, they are directed by that limited insight. And I think that limited insight, whether it's known to them or not, again, we've spoken before about evil and wicked. One of the distinctions that we made was that the wicked may or may not know that they are in the wrong, whereas the evil, they know that they are wrong, but they do it anyway. The wicked, it is possible that they just don't know what they are doing is wrong. In any case, the blind man knows not where he places his feet. Moreover, from that, if he is not concerned about that which is outside of him, certainly he will not have a care for where he places his feet. And as a result, he is bound to stumble. He is bound to find a surface that is uneven and unexpected and fall. And this fall, again, whether intended or not, may lead to violence. Any number of scenarios may lead to this. Desperation, the wrong done to another that comes back on the self of that person. He that keeps his mouth keeps his life, but he that opens wide his lips shall have destruction. This seems like a good follow-up verse to the one that we had just read. What I think about here, when I read, he that keeps his mouth keeps his life, I think of a discerning person. Again, discerning is a word that is quite important to that of the upright person, the righteous person. It means to have or to show good judgment, to be judicious, to be selective. Now, to keep something, what comes to mind is to hold something, to have in one's possession. Just like in the Platonic sense of epistemological matters, when we say possess something versus having something, this possession is almost equivalent here to that of keep. The analogy that or the illustration that he uses is that of birds in an aviary. The hunter, he captures a bird which he extends an equivalency to that of a memory. And at that moment that he has the bird, he has it. But when he stores that information that that bird represents as a memory, he releases it into his aviary, this enclosed space. And now it is said that he can possess, or he possesses, that information. However, it may not be readily available to him at the moment, but it is stored as a memory. And maybe that something must prompt him for him to, again, to have it, for him to return to the aviary of his mind, his memory. And in this way, he that keeps his mouth keeps his life. I think of possessing. I also think of having, quite frankly. In any case, it has to do with that of attention. This willful attention to one's judgment. To say something is to endow meaning to the world. It is to make a connection within the mind, whether sophisticated or not, and to express it. And so to keep the mouth, to keep that thing that is the vehicle of that expression, I think it means to exercise good judgment in speech. And as one exercises good judgment in speech, he keeps his life. Now, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that it saves him from violence, so that he keeps his existence in his physical existence? Certainly that's possible. That's the low-hanging fruit of of one possible meaning, one possible interpretation. But I think, in a more sophisticated manner, this keeping of his life means that he is in control of it. It does not fall prey to evil forces that are out there in the environment. The mind viruses of man that seemingly come to him from supernatural sources. Or again, something that can come to him without his understanding. Just as blind ignorance is enough for him to lose his life, to lose control, to not understand the way in which he should walk, to not understand the ways of the upright, or not be concerned with the ways of the upright. But he that opens wide his lips shall have destruction. The man who speaks, not necessarily freely, but the man who does not control his speech, the man that does not exercise good judgment. This will lead to his ruin, his destruction. You know, it's interesting what you can find just off of a basic dictionary definition of destruction. It is the action or process of causing so much damage to something that it no longer exists or cannot be repaired. And I think that this fits quite well with our discussion about identity. That man himself, if he does not exercise good judgment and discretion, his very identity can come apart. So much damage can be caused that the way in which it presents itself to the world will change fundamentally. Now, of destruction, we can expand this to many different things. We can expand it to personal relationships. We can expand it to business relationships. But I like the fundamental. I like the identity argument. Because I like the subtlety about the identity of man. How delicate it is. A couple chapters ago, we were talking a lot about the alignment problem, in which we are aligning the individual, including the self, the heart, the soul, everything, to that of the highest standard, that divine logos, to God. And how our minds, and how the scientific processes by which we determine truth. It's much more difficult when we talk about one's own personal identity. I think about the era in which we find ourselves. That is fundamentally an era of confusion and the destruction of identity. The destruction of rightful identity. That people seemingly cannot exist unless their identity, whatever they believe it to be, is confirmed. Now it seems obvious to me how subtle these things can be, because there must be grace here, because no one truly knows. We have a lot of information given to us by our ancestors. We have a lot of information given to us by science that can help assist us in determining how we should be, how we should formulate our identities, how the self should be, in relation to the world, in relation to God. But it is still very difficult. And without love, it is next to impossible. One final thought, perhaps, on this verse about the wide-open lips leading to one's destruction, and playing off of what we just discussed about that of identity. If one's identity is going to be that which is facilitated and nourished by the wicked mind, then it will be inherently selfish. And that inherent selfishness, that closing off to the rest of reality for the purposes of one's own conscious experience, their own abstraction, their own model of the world, in its extreme, I think it can lead to continual disillusion, continual breaking down of barriers, breaking down of things that ought to be intact. And it leads to such a state of confusion that a person may not even be able to tell what gender they are, what master they serve, what they ought to do in life, their purpose on the earth. That extends to many things, and this fundamental confusion and the lack of light, insight, must create such a fundamental insecurity that's like a destructive wind, a hurricane, that just rips up everything in its path. The soul of the sluggard desires and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made fat. Now, reluctantly, I would have to say that I think that I have a bit of the soul of the sluggard. I often find myself desiring things as I'm doing nothing. It's certainly a bad habit, and it's a process of improving oneself that, first and foremost, the action and the behavior is there, but those thoughts and desires, in a secondary sense, are brought to kneel. Of course, one that does nothing but desire will not achieve their desires because nothing is being done. The soul of the diligent, that of the focused, that of the attentive, that of the discerning, shall achieve things in life. And keeping in mind that this is an ancient book, the famine was one of those things that was the consequence for this sluggish behavior. Whereas these days, sluggish behavior might keep one or restrict one to a minimum wage job, in those days, it led to starvation and death. And so it's no wonder why the language that is used here, shall be made fat, is here. Because that was something that was desirable. Now the fatness, obviously, could deserve a bit of nuance, because the point at which someone becomes fat, I would say that is sinful. That's over excess. But again, I suppose it can be forgiven, given the context of famine and how severe that must be on the mind. A righteous man hates lying, but a wicked man is loathsome and comes to shame. I was thinking of the qualities of the main character in the movie Cool Hand Luke, Paul Newman's character. And he's a character of, he's cool, so he has this way about him and this understanding of things that makes him a desirable figure, somebody that people can look up to in a certain sense. He knows the way of things, and yet he doesn't follow through on them. And he's always in this state of stagnation. Quite an anxiety-inducing thought, to be completely honest. And again, I feel as though I have some of these qualities. That I have a degree of insight. However unsophisticated it may be, there is something there. And often I find myself coming up short of where I should be. And this has plagued me for a long time. Surely it plagues many people. And it's one of the hardest things to correct, I would say, if one is on the journey towards God and towards a higher standard. It seems as though the honesty comes before the action. Honesty in the sense that one is able to see what is wrong about one's behavior quite clearly, quite painfully, so that the shame may overwhelm them, and yet the behavior doesn't change, and it's just this spiral down into a bit of a despair. And this is loathsome. That is something that causes hatred or disgust, something that is repulsive. It's a curious thing why seemingly the simplest things in life, like just paying attention, can be so difficult. The more we attend, the more we see, in a certain sense. The more we see, the more we have to filter. It's the more work we have to do, the more work the mind has to do to determine the path that it should be walking. And it's frightening. It's a heavy burden to bear, that of existence, and that of all of the things that we can take in, all of the information that we can take in and possibly attend to. Certainly it can lead to self-limiting behavior. Excuses of all flavors and colors, of all varieties. There's nothing quite like shame as a feeling, a genuine feeling, if one is unfortunate enough to experience it. But shame is felt, I think, because of this loathsome nature. It comes from the disgust of one's own actions. Certainly this disgust and this repulsiveness increases if time has gone by, actions have not been corrected, and some penultimate result, some accumulation of this behavior comes to a head. And what comes forth, what blooms, is shame. It spreads darkness, it spreads despair. A difficult thing to deal with. But again, one must be aware of it in order for it even to affect the person. This Cool Hand Luke syndrome. Righteousness keeps him that is upright in the way, but wickedness overthrows the sinner. I think at this point it's good to recognize something that I recognize often on these podcasts, and that has to do with repetition to a certain degree. What do I mean by repetition? Well, often you see words that have quite large and broad meanings, words that if we took them out of where I see them here in Proverbs chapter 13, and I was to pluck it into the mind of Socrates, we'd have an extensive dialogue to talk about it. A word like righteousness is no simple matter, and I think it's often easy for us for myself, to say, okay, well, righteousness is known by God. It is the standard by which, if we are to act in a certain way in accordance, in alignment with a certain standard, then we are considered righteous. But it doesn't help us at all in life. It doesn't help us unless we actually explore what righteousness is, and it means we have to do a lot of the dirty work. We have to get our hands dirty. It's uncomfortable, it's difficult, but it needs to be done. And the second thing that I'd have to say is that wisdom and learning, especially the proverbial learning, is slow, and oftentimes it does require repetition. Oftentimes we find ourselves back to where we started in a certain sense, a superficial layer of understanding, whereas at one time perhaps we embarked on a quite sophisticated journey to unpack and uncover all the beauty that righteousness can hold. And yet we forget. We come back to it. We re-explore. Or perhaps we've done that exercise. We've come across righteousness again, but because of our previous exercise, we didn't think much of it. We were satisfied with our exercise that we had performed, and we leave it as it is. And I wouldn't necessarily say that that's wrong. But if we left it that way, and if we didn't return to it, that certainly would be wrong. Eventually, our understanding of righteousness would atrophy. Our grasp on it would become weakened. It would slip through our fingers. And even though there is no explicit explanation for what righteousness is, there are pointers to what it is, or what it is not. And while in future books we may see more sophisticated explanations of some of these fundamental principles, it doesn't, and it should not, dissuade us from exploring, again, that beauty of what some of these terms mean. So of this verse, righteousness keeps him that is upright in the way, but wickedness overthroweth the sinner. Again, what can we say of this righteousness? More fundamentally, I suppose, a more fundamental question would be, is it possible to come to some definition of righteousness just on our own? Let's say, just as in my case, talking into this microphone. By sheer will alone am I able to come up with something that gives an appropriate account, some justifiable reason for the character of a just person. Well, certainly we can try. So let's talk for a moment about what we know, what we can take from this verse. We know that there's a certain type of person that walks in the way. This is the righteous person. And righteousness keeps this person that is upright. Now here, righteousness and upright, on the surface they seem like equivalent terms, because the righteous person is an upright person. But here we have sort of the Platonic form of righteousness, that source of righteousness that can be tapped into by the conscious mind. We know that wickedness, something that we've talked a lot about in the Proverbs, something that is of a person that is contrary, they're antagonistic, they don't necessarily give much forethought to the future. They don't give much forethought to their behaviors or their actions. They can be a bit selfish. They are selfish. I suppose I should correct myself. And in the same way that righteousness is used in the first half of that verse, wickedness is used in the second half. So almost like a Platonic form, an idealized identity of its own. A source, a pool, a well to be drawn from. And this wickedness, or perhaps we can say an agent, and this wickedness overthrows the sinner. Now, in this context, obviously, overthrowing the sinner is not to dispose of the sinner. The overthrowing of the sinner is a negative implication, that they are overthrown, their will has been overthrown, they have been taken over, they have been parasitized by the parasite of wickedness. Now the easy place to go from here is to discuss righteousness in terms of the opposite of that of wickedness. That if we say wickedness is of a person selfish and antagonistic, contrary, sinful, regardless of whether or not they will it to be, without discretion. Righteousness would be a person of discretion, a person of forward thought, someone that actively wishes to do good, to have moral principles, to be in the right, to behave in such a way that their actions are considered justifiable, that there is an account that can be given, some reason that can be given. But this reason is multifaceted. We can give any number of reasons for any particular thing. We can give any number of accounts to justify our behavior. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's right. It may make sense. We may be able to convince somebody of a logical line of thinking why a particular behavior was performed, but it doesn't mean it is morally justifiable. It just means it's logically coherent. And so the difficult thing is, how do we separate that which is morally justifiable from that which is logically coherent? And moreover from that, I would say the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. However, in terms of the wicked, where one may find themselves in a position of attempting to justify their actions, may not appeal to that of the moral standing or the moral path, the way, as it says here. Righteousness keepeth him that is upright in the way. In such cases, it's necessary to separate the logically coherent from the morally justifiable. We can have a situation in which a person may do a wicked action. We can say of their behavior that the means, or the ends, I should say, justify the means. That is, they desire something, and it doesn't really matter what path they walk to get there. And so perhaps of the righteous we can say, at the very least, the path that they choose to take matters. They cannot just take any old path to reach a goal or a destination that they have in mind, forward-thinking as they are. Multiple paths will undoubtedly be presented before them. So the question then becomes, we can justify every single one of our paths. Perhaps we can cross a few different paths off the list because they just are nonsensical. They don't appeal to much of anything. Perhaps they are not consistent in terms of their, or efficient perhaps in terms of their route to get to our goal. Perhaps they don't even go in the direction of our goal. And so our reason, outside of our moral justification, would exclude these paths before we even brought in the question of moral justification. So now before us we have a bunch of different options. What option do we choose? One option, perhaps, we can find ourselves at the edge of a forest, a path, a hiking trail. We can choose one path that involves certain sacrifices, certain decisions that one must make that involve ethical, moral decisions. Some of these decisions require the self to be put above that of another. Can we say, then, in every case, that if we take a selfish action over the care and consideration of another, that is, care and consideration over something or someone that is outside of ourself, can we say confidently that in every case that this is morally justifiable? I'm not entirely sure that we can, but I'm also not entirely sure that exploring every possibility, every possible scenario, is a way to solve this problem. So we have to think again about exactly how we are going to choose this path. I think it's not completely off the mark where we just began that line of thinking about the self in relation to that which is outside of the self. We are thinking with prudence in mind. We want principles that we can rely on. And so we abandon that which is tedious, perhaps, ineffective, transitory. We are concerned about right and wrong behavior. And in the absence of an absolute, that whenever we perform an action or behavior, a light goes on to give us an indication that we have achieved the right, or perhaps if a red light appears to us after a behavior or an action, that indicates to us that we have done some wrong. This certainly would make things easier, but it would not make us willful agents. We would be directed, controlled. We would have no free will. And since we have this freedom of will, things become more difficult. Again, we require stable principles. We require some procedure by which we can come to determine that which is morally right. Certainly, we should not provide the burden for our shoulders, to our shoulders, on our shoulders, of being right in every single scenario. We should be gracious with our lives and with our undertakings. However, having said that, we should not use that grace as an excuse not to, in every case, consider however fleetingly, if what we are doing is right. By what markers can we consider our behavior right or just, morally just? Perhaps we can say that it is by convention. It is by the opinions of others, the feedback that we get from others, that will help us to determine the degree of rightness, or wrongfulness. Certainly that's no guarantee. The feedback that we get from others depends on the perception, the opinions, and the belief of others, which can just as easily be confused as our own. And in the unfortunate situation or scenario where we are getting false information about our behaviors that reinforces perhaps something negative under the belief that we are doing something positive, would lead us to wickedness, into darkness. And certainly this is often how temptation comes to find us. It is through our desire to do good, that which presents itself with a superficial layer of goodness, but beneath is just hollow nothingness. It tempts us to occupy its space, to fill its void, so that it can have something to act in the world. And once it has us, we realize that we are in this vacuum, this space of nothingness, this place of meaninglessness, perhaps a place of faithlessness, disruption in confidence. And so I'll say two things in regards to this. The first, I would say, if we find ourselves in a position such as this, that of profound confusion and of feelings of insecurity, as though we are swept up in some strong hurricane, no grounding, and the choices we make are almost like on a multiple choice exam. We are just sort of picking an answer because we have absolutely no idea. We have nothing to go on. Then I would say that this situation needs to be remedied. There must be something that we can grab onto, something relevant to our situation. And so this affords us, in a sense, at least an impetus to change our behavior when we feel that we are lost. Secondly, I would say that although there are potential pitfalls in the opinions and the feedback of others, we should not discount it wholeheartedly, because certainly it can be correct. But also, having said that, we have to keep in mind that because of this dual nature, the possibility of the moral judgments of others and their judgments on us being possibly correct or possibly wrong, I think should at least cue us into thinking that this is not the only thing that we should rely on. It should be one but a number of things that we take with us to determine what is morally right or justifiable. The same goes for our feelings. Our feelings can be just as misleading as a judgment of another. But sometimes they are spot on. Often feelings of emptiness or shame, as we have discussed in previous verses, come because of a certain behavior, a certain decision made somewhere up the chain that has had consequences that have led us to such a state of despair or shame. So just as we listen to the judgments of others, we should listen to the feelings of our heart and trace it back to some logical place. We should try to find the bedrock, or the source of its energy, the source of its motion, whatever adjective we want to use. And the third way, I think we can think about things in terms of deduction, following a line of thinking, using first principles. We could think about efficiency. We could think about expenditure of energy. That which is efficient can be considered right in some circumstances. We could think of it in a fourth manner, that of presence, that we embark on a journey, we choose a path, and now we are walking that path. Surely we will make mistakes. We will take steps that we ought not to take. And it's up to the individual as they are on their journey and on their path to recognize the steps that they have taken that are off course, so that when they correct a step, which in the broader expanse of the journey, it means relatively little. It doesn't compromise the goal. It doesn't make us irredeemable beings. But it allows us to learn. And although we should not actively attempt to do wrong, wrong will eventually come to us. And so of this, I would say it's a matter of attention and a matter of discretion. So we have the feedback of others. We have the stirring of the heart, the internal feedback, we might say. We have that of sort of logical efficiency. And we have that of attention to detail, recognizing and practicing when we have made a misstep. But still, all of these don't necessarily tell us what is right in a particular situation. They don't cure us of our blindness. And perhaps this is just the point. We are born blind, and yet we have the ability to sense certain things. And although we are limited, I think we have to understand and accept how limited we are. We remain humble, while actively attending to the needs of our heart, as well as the needs of our neighbors. To adjust our goals so the path that we are walking doesn't lead us into a selfish, narcissistic spiral. But that we stand up and stand tall in the face of that which is telling us that we should sit down and fall asleep. Stay blind instead of attempt to see. But wickedness overthroweth the sinner. Those that give in those that lose faith, those that feel as though our limitations are too much to handle the burdens of our existence, those that choose that slothful nature, that rest over the productive forces, the journey, the path, the accomplishment of goals, to a degree suffering. But certainly the pursuit of the righteous path, I think, can lead one into a state of stagnation, constantly sitting at the precipice or the beginning of a journey, deciding which path that they should take, all the pros and the cons of it. This leads us to our fourth principle, that of the active, that of the doing, that of the attention while the path is being walked. There's just a certain degree of understanding and knowing that will come from the experience of life. And so to the unfortunate man that may be considered wicked or fall to a degree of wickedness because of his stagnation in his attempt to be a righteous person, to this person we should advise, and to those situations in our life, I think we should advise ourselves to take the step, regardless of if that step is a flip of a coin. That is, the step that we take may be morally corrupt, despite our will. But if our will is good, then we can learn from our mistakes. If our will is not good, or if it is wicked, we care not for the learning of our mistakes. We are inattentive, and through our anxiety we continue to fumble through the forest, through the path, walking in circles, never really reaching some goal, passing the same landmarks without recognizing where we are, where we have been. And in this way, perhaps righteousness then keeps those of us that follow this path. Verse 7, there is that makes himself rich, yet has nothing. There is that makes himself poor, yet has great riches. Now in the recognition of the double-edged swords that present themselves throughout the Proverbs, I think it's important that we recognize where we are. This verse, although it is possible to imagine a situation in which this is not the case, it is not for us to say that we should not be able to recognize the pattern as it is. There are many patterns. This one happens to reflect on a certain type of richness, a certain type of value that is not fulfilling. It is of a value of lower sorts that one attempts to fill the soul and to satisfy the rumblings of the heart. This may be an attempt to satisfy it through a poor diet, let's say, eating sweets continually. This may be probably the thing that is in most people's minds when they read this, that of the person that strives continually in life for material goods and material comforts, and yet is completely empty, lonely inside. And yet On the other hand, there is a person who is poor in a certain sense, perhaps poor in the sense that they do not have a large amount of material goods, material comforts. Yet they have profound meaning in their life. They have strong familial relations. They are not sinners. They are not burdened by the decisions that they've made. They have been attentive in the path that they have walked. And now what I mentioned earlier, that there are many potential patterns, I think it's easy to get distracted, because certainly we can say that it's possible for a man of poor material circumstances to be empty inside, not have great riches. Certainly we know many of these types of poor people that have unfortunately succumbed to that temptation and wickedness and found themselves in the throes of an addiction, having neither material comforts or love to sustain them. Just as we can imagine a case in which one has an abundance of material goods and strong familial or personal relationships that are fulfilling and sustaining. But the point here is that just because, perhaps it's easy to think, that if one just has material goods, then all their problems would be solved. The verse here is saying it's not the case. It's something a little bit more nuanced than that. And if we can say something in conclusion to this verse, I think it should be that the righteous person does not place their faith in material goods alone. Material comforts may be valuable, but they will not allow us to reach that heavenly end goal. The ransom of a man's life are his riches, but the poor hears not rebuke. Now, an interesting verse to follow up the one that we just had, verse 7. It's interesting because this is a brand new pattern. This is almost the opposite. This is flipping the coin. It is giving us a degree of nuance. The ransom of a man's life are his riches. When I think of ransom, I think of some demand for the release of someone or something from a state of captivity. And if someone's riches, I think my mind goes to material, but of course, as we've discussed, it's not just material that has the distinction of what is valuable or what is considered to be riches or treasures. And so if we think about it in this way, the ransom of a man's life are his riches. That is to say, if he is to have his life, perhaps to enjoy it, to be at peace with his life and his existence, he must be willing to sacrifice that which he has. Now, the sacrifice is an interesting thing because it's something that's inherently enriching. Because in the sense of sacrifice, we mean to give it up, not necessarily to go without, to give it for. So in the case of something that is truly valuable, let's say, a relationship of love. What does it mean to sacrifice this relationship of love? This thing of spiritual value. If we are to give up our selfish pursuits, I would say, of this love, we give it up for the sake of God and for the sake of God's definition of what love is, then what we are given is a richer sense, a preserved life in a way, a more colorful experience. In a more literal manner, material riches can be sacrificed literally to save one's life. They are useful for getting a person out of a difficult situation. They can provide riches, material riches can provide food, shelter, in situations where it is difficult on the multitude to have such things. And so we sacrifice these material goods to sustain ourselves, just as we sacrifice a rather selfish view of what love might be for something that is more pure, something that is designed and created higher than that which is known to us. The poor hears not rebuke. They don't listen to the advice that comes from our metaphorical or literal misstep on this journey. They are not attentive, they are not discerning. And of the person that we had thought about at the beginning of the journey who just can't decide on the path to walk, I think that this can apply just as much. And I'll have to admit, sometimes I think that the rebuke is hard to hear. Not necessarily because of the truthfulness of the rebuke, but because of the truthfulness that can get drowned out in the noise of everything else. Of a man that has difficulty deciding on the path. What of the man that has decided on a path but can't seem to see that the path that he has chosen is not the one for him, or that at least he should make a course correction? Very, very difficult questions in the life of a man. I think even harder sometimes to hear the rebuke. Perhaps the rebuke is heard, but because everything else is so loud, perhaps because the attention is so poor, that it's hard to hear. And I think we can admit, in certain situations, the harder we listen, the more difficult it is to hear. Not necessarily because we are being inattentive, but because we are trying to attend to everything. It is sort of an Icarus type of situation. We are trying to reach the enlightenment of that of a God, and yet we remain human, and we can't do such things. And because of our contempt for ourselves, we wish to bury ourselves, or to destroy ourselves, to think ourselves unworthy of anything that is worthwhile, any riches whatsoever. And I think that in and of itself, that lack of humility, and the arrogance to think that one can handle all of it, to accept all of that, I think the inability to accept that one cannot attend to everything while also failing to understand that attention is extremely important. Attention and discretion are fundamental and extremely important. I think is in itself, in a way, the failure to hear this rebuke. It's the failure to recognize one's position, the position of man. The position in the mind of this person, of man, is that of a being without grace, without forgiveness. I think this is one potential, one of the more difficult paths. Perhaps not one often traveled, perhaps it is often traveled, I don't know, but this is one of those that I think can lead one into despair, into this darkness, into wickedness. And the irony. It's such a powerful and beautiful word, irony, because of its sophistication. How man can just want so good for himself and for others that he himself is just taken by his desire for it. The poor hear not rebuke. The light of the righteous rejoices, but the lamp of the wicked shall be put out. So what is this symbol of the light? I think there is not just one interpretation. Perhaps there's not just one way we can think about the light. But I think that, generally speaking, if we are to say the light, we are considering something that's positive. We're considering something that is good. We are referring to that which is intelligible. Or in other words, something that is comprehensible, able to be understood. Light can be used in a way to describe knowledge and understanding. When something is visible, we're able to, or rather I should say, if something is illuminated, we are able to see it. It has a physical grounding in our reality, and it's easy to use it as a metaphor to describe a deeper truth that is understanding something. Just as in the physical example, if I did not have a reading lamp over this book, I would not be able to see the verses. And if I'm not able to see the verses, obviously I'm unable to understand or interpret what they mean. And the righteous, of course, we have just discussed this, of a person that exercises discretion. They recognize their own weaknesses and failures. They provide themselves with grace so that their recognition of weaknesses and failures don't prevent or hinder their motion. They understand that there will be mistakes in life, but one must take action, move out into the world, put one foot in front of the other, so that he may experience and learn. Perhaps most importantly, he is guided by that which he believes to be good, grounded by an understanding that there is some good that transcends himself. The righteous person is not a selfish person. However, they do understand the self well. They understand how to direct the self and to motivate the self. And so we can say of all of this, that which is to be understandable, of the type of person that takes it upon themselves to carry a particular burden, to choose a path, regardless of whether or not it is completely known to them. It is through the learning, it is through what is seen along the journey, along that trail, that puts this verse together. The light of the righteous rejoices. The rejoicing comes from gaining information and gaining knowledge of what is true. The righteous are no longer the sufferers of inactivity. They are no longer the bearers of a burden of stagnation and insufferable existential dread. They are liberated by their faith and their action in life. But the lamp of the wicked shall be put out. Again, I in my mind, I think of the wicked, we have discussed many times, a person that is selfish. They care not for other things. They don't consider much of that which is beyond them. They may recognize a transcendent truth, but they take only and request only that which benefits them and their own selfish desires. They give in to the whims of the heart. And in this way, I think of a fire without oxygen, a fire that is smothered. And of course, a fire that is smothered, it is something that is not self-sustaining. It is something that eventually will go out. It'll go out rather quickly. It'll dim into nothingness. And the fading of this light is just the opposite of what we've discussed. It is the opposite of understanding. It's the opposite of illumination and sight. It is darkness. It is blindness. It leads to confusion and uncertainty. It adds stones to the sack that we can call this existential burden. Man will try to do whatever he can to escape his blindness, or rather, I should say, to escape his blindness through selfish means. He may feel that righteous action is painful. He feels as though he is afraid to sacrifice, afraid to face failure. And because of his inaction, the lamp of his understanding shall be put out, back into the darkness, back into the pit. Only by pride comes contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom. Contention being some disagreement or dispute, some assertion made in an argument, and of this disagreement or this dispute, it is often fueled by the heart. It is fueled by emotions. It is not concerned, perhaps, our motivation for maintaining this argument is only the fuel of these emotions, and it cares not for that which is the truth of the matter. And so only by pride comes contention. Now, we've discussed pride before. Pride, I think, can be a difficult thing to think about, a difficult thing to define, perhaps I should say. So what can we say of this pride? And how does it lead to contention? Well, if we start in reverse, and we start with that disagreement or argument that is based just in emotions, how can we say that this might lead to pride? Well, in the first instance, if one is going to argue their emotions for their emotions, I think what they are primarily or chiefly concerned with is the preservation of appearances. They are afraid of anything penetrating that circle that is and comprises the self. They are afraid of anything that will attempt to change or potentially molest that identity that they find safety, comfort, and security in. And if one is to purely rest their identity in the self, of course they are bound to argue with the loose configuration of the feelings of the senses, of the desires of the heart. Just as one is perhaps hungry, facing starvation or severe thirst, that which is good and that which is just seemingly takes a back seat. Now in this case, it's understandable that one's behavior in extreme cases of privation, even up to, there are many cases in the ancient world of besieged cities in which people would sacrifice their children and consume them to maintain their existence. They are driven to such a degree because of their desires, their hunger, and this need, I should say, for self-preservation. And that's a very extreme example, but it scales down all of these levels, right down to that discussion with your friend in the car, in which one of you becomes a little bit too emotional, and the argument or the conversation now becomes something else entirely. It becomes, in the view of one, an attack on the self of the one that is defending the self, rather than a constructive conversation, or perhaps a constructive argument. In this way, I would consider this to be prideful contention. But with the well-advised is wisdom. Now, the well-advised, perhaps we can say that we can consider one to be well-advised, first and foremost, if one is receptive, and that they listen to the advice of another, that they hear, they take in information, and not just in a way to make it seem or appear. Appearances are not true, or rather I should say that the behavior of one to assume a particular appearance does not satisfy truthfully taking in information and influencing one's thoughts and actions and behaviors. If one is to truly listen to advice or to counsel, they are willing to sacrifice that part of the self that provides them, that has up until that point provided them with a degree of security and of comfort. And they come to wisdom through many long hours, I would say, of this practice of giving a just account to their judgments, of appropriately and justly listening to the advice and counsel of others. And lastly, I think that one of the qualities that we can confidently say of the well-advised, the virtue of humility, the quality of being humble, a certain plainness of being, sort of that has a moderating effect. That this moderating effect does not allow oneself to be overly confident in their abilities. They are constantly checking themselves against that which is true, or are constantly saying, perhaps, in order to regulate the self, "Are you sure? We should not rely on convention or that which is free to the air, to be blown or swept up by the wind. If at one time we knew something and we placed our confidence in that thing, and after a given amount of time, the thing that was known is now believed in, but the path and the reason that one had used to get to that place of understanding has been forgotten. then there should be a reassessment. There should be a check on the self. We do this in order to avoid that pretentiousness. The saying of knowing without actually understanding. With the well-advised is wisdom. Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall increase. Now, this is an important verse, I think, not only for myself, but for the modern day. I think it is an unfortunate fact for myself that there are many things that I do for vanity. And this vanity, again, has to do with the self. It has to do with selfishness. It has to do with appearances. It has to do with the wall that we place around ourselves, just like an old city that has a wall for protection. Each of us has a wall that we place around the individual to protect its identity, so that it feels secure. And I think often this wall is meant to deceive. Perhaps it's meant to look stronger than it actually is. And if it's stronger than it actually is, it would imply that the confidence in the nature of oneself or the identity that makes up the self is false. That behind that pristine-looking wall, perhaps the wall itself is just a veneer, and behind it is nothing but darkness, nothing but scared thoughts, insecurities, poor understanding, lack of knowledge. And so now to refer to the verse, wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished. We are thinking of a situation in which an individual pursues a career. Perhaps it's well-paying, but they pursue it for the sake of the riches. They pursue the occupation because it pays well. Now there's a degree of sophistication I think that we have to have here. We must remain humble. We must check ourselves. We must ask ourselves if we are being pretentious. Because it is not in every case, in every situation, that the desire for a better life, for material prosperity, for a position, and the sacrifice that one has to make in order to achieve something in the material world, that this is completely poor and misguided. I don't think that's true at all. I think often a person that makes lofty sacrifices and receives material rewards, or receives a type of life that affords them certain types of comforts, certain liberties, I would say, the most important of which I would consider to be time to do what is most fulfilling not necessarily to the self, but that which is beneficial to the self and also to others. The path and the attempt to understand that which is beyond the self, the source of that thing that enriches the self. I think that there are pursuits that will allow us to afford this way of being. And we may ask ourselves, well, what is In what way shall we look upon this vanity? Certainly it's a certain condition, it's a certain circumstance, a certain way of seeing, a path of walking that leads us to this position, this point in life, where we are free to make the decisions that will benefit our families or that will enhance our experience in the world. Certainly it should not be the case that we sacrifice the ends for the sake of vanity. Certainly the path that we walk, the means by which we come to those ends, we should not be submerged in this selfishness or attempt to construct this tower of superficiality, of fakery, to put on a facade, and to play a game and a character. The path to riches is not wrong in and of itself, but we recognize here that through this verse, this vanity, the superficialness, the falsehood that is required, that one must accept and keep quite close to them day after day, they integrate this falsehood into their being. And I think that when they come to the end, when they reach that material gain, they are significantly diminished. And the only thing that would satisfy is by spending the wealth, the riches, on things that will perpetuate this vanity and this veneer, whether it be gambling, drug addiction, sex, whatever it might be. They find through the desires the most superficial of attachments and formations of relationships, and value of people and of things. But he that gathers by labor shall increase. An interesting way to put it, because certainly wealth that is gotten by vanity can be a particular type of labor. It's just a particular way of thinking, and a particular behavior, and a particular pursuit. What we are seeing here in the second half of this verse, he that gathers by labor, this labor is just labor. This is a sacrifice for the end. But it's not just the sacrifice. It's not a selfish sacrifice. It's the type of sacrifice that is long-lasting. It is resistant to the pathogen, to the virus, to the erosion of wealth. This type of sacrifice through labor is not just occupational. It is a labor of love. The labor includes the sacrifice that one gives to their children, so that they may understand the principles by which they can live and achieve success in life, live a life that is fulfilled and fulfilling. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when the desire comes, it is a tree of life. Now, to defer something is to put it off into the future. And hope is to have an idea or a belief that their life, their existence, the path that they are on will lead to something greater. If one is to hope for the future, they are to wish for better things than they have at the present. But it's not just basic things. It is quite substantial things. We are thinking of that which puts us at ease, allows us to readily fall asleep at night. The mind is not, or is no longer, a burden. And to have hope in such things, I think, is good for us. But to put it off, to deny such a thing, would make the heart sick, and by extension, it would cause a swirling of these desires and these feelings, a never-ending hurricane within this enclosed space, constantly gnawing and aggravating us. But when the desire comes, it is a tree of life. And perhaps it means when the desire for hope comes, it is a tree of life. It is something with many branches. It is of something that provides many opportunities. It provides one with motivation. It makes that which is required for meaningful outcomes manageable. Whoso despises the word shall be destroyed, but he that fears the commandment shall be rewarded. The law of the wise is a foundation of life, to depart from the snares of death. What we are saying, or what we are seeing here, is the principle of the discerning man, of the attentive man, serves as the bedrock, the support by which life, the flourishing of our existence, revolves around. It hangs on to it. It finds safety there. It finds understanding there. It finds purpose there. And in this way, death is avoided. Now, death of a particular kind of identity, I would have to imagine. The identity of a particular type of man. The selfish man, of course, we've heard in numerous verses in the Proverbs and elsewhere, comes to a slowly decreasing luminosity into a gradual defeat and darkness. Whereas the man that is without wickedness, that is not particularly selfish, but has a strong identity such that they can make the proper sacrifices. The identity of this individual is the one that transcends time, that passes the principle on to their children, that life, that thing that is more than just one person, more than just the selfish identity of one person. That thing transcends, and the particular type of life, that particular type of consciousness continues. Good understanding gives favor, but the way of transgressors is hard. A difficult fact of life, especially for us, especially for man, that is the human being. The experience of life is such a thing, with so many ups and so many downs. So many periods of learning, inadvertent transgression, forgiveness and grace, but also, at times, self-defeat, denial, hopelessness. Something that is easy to say, good understanding gives favor, but the way of transgressors is hard, much more difficult to see in the world, with all of its variability. Every prudent man deals with knowledge, but a fool lays open his folly, dealing with knowledge with the thought of the future. And prudence is of a mind that is well maintained, well judged, again discerning for the future. But a fool lays open his folly, his mistakes, it's more than just mistakes. Perhaps it's the unrecognized mistake, the perpetuation of the cycle of defeat. It is the lack of good sense, foolishness, this folly. A wicked messenger falls into mischief, but a faithful ambassador is health. In my mind, the illustration that immediately comes to mind is that of a mailman that represents this messenger. But what of this mailman, what of this messenger, what does he bring? He brings information, he brings letters. Upon those letters are purposefully directed information to the individuals to whom they are addressed. Beyond the limitations of this analogy, in general, the messenger is a carrier. It is carrier of information. The one that is wicked, a carrier of information that falls into selfish pursuits and desires, falls into depravity, this mischief, behavior that is up to no good. They carry messages and information in attempts to deceive, to throw off. And so that when they find that their prey has been put off, it affords them the opportunity to take advantage. A faithful ambassador is health. When I think of an ambassador, I think of a representative. I think of somebody that goes to a place with a particular focus for the well-being of something that is greater than themselves. And in this way, when we attach faithfulness to that ambassador, of course this is the ambassador of God, and this health that we see is the clearing of the mind, the relief of the existential burden, the health of the body, the maintenance of a soul, the proper direction of the desires, the feelings of the heart, which can be so hard to direct or to understand how to direct them. Poverty and shame shall be to him that refuses instruction, but he that regards reproof shall be honored. A confession of mine, I think, would be that it has taken me a long time, much longer than it should have in life, to accept instruction. Now, I think that, at least speaking for myself, there are many potential barriers that prevent one from having a receptive ear towards that which would attempt to correct my course of action, so that I don't continue to fail, to wallow in a certain type of misery. And there was an awakening in my life, and I think that even though at the moment of that awakening not everything changed, but certainly the awareness dawned on me of the importance of accepting instruction, even if the instruction is false. That is to say, even if the person that is attempting to make a correction, or perhaps is attempting to deceive under the guise of instruction. The practice and the receptive ear and the critical mind, I think, is a necessary step for one to come to know God. It is a necessary step to come to know what is highest, the highest good, for example. How can one know the highest good if they convince themselves that all they need is their own selfish ideas of what the ultimate good is? All great virtues, I think, start with humility. Without it, and without that receptivity, the understanding that all of reality and the ways of things are not at once understood by a single mind. Poverty and shame, that which is lacking in shame, the result of a guilty judgment. The view of a man above looking down within himself, attempting to dissociate himself from the flood that breaks his walls. The man that denies reality, that prefers a delusion to that which is true. Shame, to a certain degree, is the result of a complete surrendering to that of the truth. Shame, I think, can also come about due to the prolonged denial of a particular path in life that perhaps one has been living contrary, so contrary, in fact. But all the while there's a small piece of them on the inside that understands that what they have been engaged in is wrong. And when that small piece is brought to the forefront, that little seed is planted into the ground, into the earth of the soul, perhaps the substrate of the soul, and it is allowed or facilitated to grow by God's hand. I think, just like many diseases, unfortunate diseases in which the immune system creates a self-harming effect. There's no shortage of autoimmune diseases, which our own immune system creates antagonistic effects, symptoms that can go so far as to break down joints and to disrupt the function of organs. So as in this example, the self, this conglomeration of different aspects of the material substrate of the mind that allows us as conscious beings to see reality, to be of a divine, or to have the insight into the divine nature. This thing that is the self becomes just like this autoimmune disease, in which the self is now attacking the being that it is. This shame is a terrible thing, leading to depression, leading to a wild fluctuations of the heart. Every experience and every feeling a sharp and painful dagger into our experience of life. This is shame. But he that regards reproof shall be honored. Now, what does this honoring mean? Of course, the second half of this verse is the other side of the coin. This regard is this acceptance of criticism, acceptance of correction by another, by some outside source. But as a result of that, if poverty and shame are to be the result of the refusal of instruction, then what does he that regards reproof shall be honored mean? What is this honoring? First thought that comes to mind is honor thy mother, honor thy father. This is, of course, in a similar vein, the relationship a child has to his or her parents. The child, a microcosm for what we are speaking of here, more generally, towards the life of a man. The child is much reduced in terms of his capacity and ability to understand the world around him, to make effective decisions on his own. And by honoring one's mother and one's father, the child is effectively sacrificing that part of themselves that would rather see their own desires and their own will be paramount to everything else. And of course, children often have this sense of independence, and it can be difficult to snap them into a state of reason, a state of understanding. I think a certain amount of subtlety over time would avoid some of the more nasty pitfalls of the rebellious child, but certainly this honoring has to do, at least to a degree, with a sacrifice of the part of the self. And the interesting thing about this sacrifice is that it takes the recognition by the self in order for it to willfully give up, to surrender towards something that they quite don't understand, that they are not confident in, but ought to have faith in, so that in the future they can come to some higher truth, to some more elevated understanding. Now, this is not the place necessarily to talk about the wicked parents and how all the different ways that they can disrupt a child's life and lead them down a negative path. If we are to zoom out of the microcosm of the child and its relationships, and his or her relationships to his or her parents, and we think about just the life of an adult, any normal person, almost in a reverse manner, I think we see that the honoring that comes from some external source, a person, it comes to us because they recognize our selflessness. They recognize that we value something greater than ourselves. And I think it is in the recognition of that sacrifice. Again, the sacrifice is the sacrifice of selfishness. It is the relinquishing of wickedness and wicked behavior. And for whatever reason, the people that are receptive to this sort of thing are and have the ability, I think, to honor, to bestow that quality, that characteristic, whatever we might say of honor, that virtue, to the individual that has made that sacrifice, the sacrifice again of selflessness. The desire accomplished is sweet to the soul, but it is abomination to fools to depart from evil. Now it's an interesting use of language here. The desire accomplished is sweet to the soul, because we don't have an additional qualifier to that of the desire. We speak frequently of the nature of the heart and how it is often this misguided, free, turbulent thing that is composed of our emotions and our desires, often without restraint or without guidance. In such cases, certainly this object of us, of our person, can lead us into the most at once I want to say simple, but simple is not the right word. Destitute comes to mind. Simple in the sense that it is low, not simple in the sense that it is good. Lowly in the sense, at least in the sense of possibility, of the lowly, the undirected heart, directed towards the lower goods, the inferior desires and passions, the chasing of inferior goods, the chasing of sexual appetite, or perhaps just a physical appetite, gluttony. The propping up of perceived virtues because of some idol. Idolatry can often, I think, mislead the heart into valuing things that are superficial and vain. I think of all of the pop stars and the rock stars, many of whom I enjoy the music. Perhaps I can at least afford myself the grace of saying that I don't worship them as idols, but there are some that perhaps in their youth or in general worship certain figures, and it doesn't have to just be pop stars. It can be business, people in business, high-performing executives. Again, it's not the case that all high-performing executives are and can be considered idols. I think that they can be made idols of, and certainly there are many that are in a position of leadership, but their position of leadership is on the top of a mountain of coal upon an ocean of darkness. in a business of thievery, there are certain types of these individuals that care for nothing except for their own selfish purposes. These are the wicked leaders of the modern day. But of course they've always existed. Now I say all that to say that it's interesting that the language is used, the desire accomplished is sweet to the soul. Again, there is no qualifier. I would like to see the good desire accomplished. The desiring of that which is highest, the desiring of the Lord. Perhaps something that, for us modern folks, something that is easier to grab onto. But if we are to say for a moment that this is, like many of the verses that we've seen so far, we have one side of the coin which is positive, the other its opposite, which can be considered its negative. The second half of this verse is clearly negative, but it is abomination to fools to depart from evil. That is to say, the fools are the ones that desire evil. And so the opposite side of this coin, if we are to flip from the foolish to that of the first part of this verse, the desire accomplished is sweet to the soul, it implies a good desire. Perhaps a selfless desire. The second half of this verse is an inversion of the good. It is an inversion of the way of the upright path. An abomination is a thing that causes disgust or hatred. Now, of somebody that has this reaction of disgust or hatred to the path that is contrary to evil, we can see just how blind and dark the place that they inhabit really is. Evil is malevolence personified. Malevolence, I think, implies this willful wickedness. That is to do contrary for the sake of that which is contrary. To ultimately dissolve rather than to build up in every case. I think of the of the possibilities of and the reasons why a society or a people might rebel against an authority, commit themselves to a revolution. There's a certain type of way about these people that wish to dissolve something in the hopes for something new. Now, in the righteous sense, this is in the hopes for something new that is greater than that which is. Now, I would have to imagine, just as in all societies at all times, the evil in a rebellion or in a revolution would attempt to, or perhaps I should back up and say that they would relish in the fact that there's a dissolution taking place. And they would want one of two things. Either they would want a permanent state of confusion and destitution, or they would want to control the pieces that were broken apart. it's likely that it's the latter. They would like to control, they would like to have a totalitarian state, they would like despotism, as opposed to liberation. He that walks with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed. Evil pursues sinners, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. The sinner, whether willful or not, just as I've discussed many times about the wicked that are trapped within this narrow confines of selfishness, the sin, just like the wicked, can be intentional or not. We are all sinners, regardless of if we wish to be or not. By the very fact that we just do not know the whole of our reality, the purpose of our existence, means that at some point in our life we will make a misstep. Some make larger missteps than others. Some do so willfully. Some do so accidentally. But regardless of the intentionality, now intentionality is a big deal and it's very important, but I think regardless of it, when the sin occurs, and certainly if it's failed to be recognized, it leaves an opportunity for this evil to take place or to inhabit the heart or the soul of an individual. And in such a way, this evil can be personified. It can gain a material existence, a material life for itself. And so I think in this way, evil pursues sinners. But to the righteous, good shall be repaid. A difficult verse, seemingly straightforward. It's always a matter of how. Evil seems to be more straightforward. I think that is because that the good, I think, can sometimes be so elusive. Or perhaps I should say, more correctly, that the good is so expansive. That what could good possibly mean in the human context? If we imagine ourselves, and we imagine the absence of ourselves among the landscape of life, what does that mean for reality? What does that mean for goodness? For wickedness? For evil? Such broad, such large patterns, I think, are very difficult for me to grab onto and to understand. I'm so used to and familiar of inhabiting this small, monolithic, perhaps that's not the right word. It's a monoculture. It is an identity of one. Identity of one that is conscious of itself. In this way, and the twisting of nature, of life, absent this conscious mind, absent its self-awareness, it doesn't seem to me to be lifeless. It doesn't seem to me to be pointless. But it seems to me to be difficult to understand. But as we unify this landscape into a central point, into a conscious self-aware figure, I think it becomes easier to see how righteous self-reflection and appropriate sacrifice can lead to the conscious understanding of a reward, of something that is positive, certainly when compared to something that is completely selfless and unaware of its own identity, perhaps. Maybe that's not the right way to put it. But awareness is key. Identity still exists without awareness. But awareness is a fundamental component, I think, to understand how this good shall be repaid, in combination with the beauty of the heart and the emotions that we can experience, the depth of our experience, and our relationships with one another. When goodness comes to us, I think this is rather a mythical way to interpret it, but it is like a key in a lock that unlocks a certain door. What comes out of this door is just light. It is more understanding, more awareness. It expands upon that selfless life before the experience of the conscious human mind. And so exactly the meaning behind "but to the righteous good shall be repaid," I'm not entirely sure I can get there just now. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. Now immediately I think of the modern day and the tax that we are placing on the future through our debt. An unfortunate situation for a liberal society, a society in which the people have the choice. But perhaps this is not correct. The choice perhaps was made. The choice not to get into debt, but to set the pieces in motion by which officials and representatives can allow such a thing to occur. Now, of course, a good man leaves inheritance to his children's children so they are better off, not so that they become lazy, but so that they can stand taller. They can be more upright, to have a greater degree of righteousness, let's say, a greater understanding of what it means to be good. And all of the distractions of particular types of labor will not burden these future generations. But if they do not accept the new burdens that are placed on them, then they will not reap the benefits of what their fathers had left them. The wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. We mentioned that of the evil pursuing the sinner, becoming a personification of this quality or this form in the Platonic sense. The sacrifice of the evil person is for the sake of evil. It is, again, for the sake of nothingness, for that which detracts from the good, for that which detracts from the continuation of the light of the mind and the unification of life into some awareness of itself. But not an awareness of itself for itself. but an awareness of itself to improve upon itself. By appropriate understanding and the relationship to the external world and environment. The sinner wishes just for the opposite. Again, blindness, darkness, decay, dissolution, separation. If we imagine such a population, they would grind themselves into dust, and whatever that they had would be left to those who wanted more for themselves and for their families, for their children. They wanted good things for themselves. They wanted goodness. Much food is in the tillage of the poor, but there is that is destroyed for want of judgment. I'd like to pause for a moment and share a random thought. I'm not sure exactly why the thought has occurred to me just now, but I have been referring to the heart as this disinterested organ, although fundamental to the soul, fundamental to our being. I have denied any agency to it. And I have to wonder if this is incorrect, if this is not true. That there is an agency to the heart. An agency perhaps that doesn't quite reach the level of the soul. That might be the totality of being, but includes a part of it. Our hearts can be seen as something that is given to us. It's wrought with this desire and this passion. I think it is correct to say that the heart, if undirected, can reach out into any direction and satisfy and be satisfied perhaps by inferior desires. But there's still a directionality to this heart. And I have to wonder if the heart is unique to each individual, or if the heart is like the engine in our car. It's really not unique from car to car in a certain sense. It follows similar mechanics and laws, but it is ultimately directed by the driver. But even so, of these combustion engines at least, there is variability between them. They are the same in a certain sense, but also different in a certain sense. They can vary in degrees of their horsepower, or of their cylinders, their size, of their efficiency. And however small this distinction might be, I wonder if this is an important thing to add to my conception of the heart. That is, a small degree of agency, a small degree of difference between individuals, and yet still, largely, being this thing of, perhaps included in the soul, is this container of emotions and desires, much influenced by conscious direction, much directed towards good, if that driver of this vehicle has a selfless disposition. So to return to our verse, much food is in the tillage of the poor, but there is that is destroyed for want of judgment. I think first things first, we have to unpack this tillaging. Now, to tillage something is to stir up, It is an agricultural word. That is, the farmer stirs up the soil, mixes the soil beneath it. And the general purpose of such an action is to prepare the ground, to prepare the soil for the seed that is to be planted. And so this is, in some sense, attention that is oriented towards the future. It is attention that is oriented to something that is not, it is certainly directly related to, but it is not the direct action of planting the seed. It is the preparation of planting the seed. And now it's interesting that we have this word tillage. Much food is in the tillage of the poor. That would seem to suggest that perhaps the poor are the farmers in our illustration. They work the land and they produce the food. Now I think we can say a few words of the poor, because the poor are, by extension, not necessarily ignorant, but we can extend a degree of this line of thinking to that of the poor, that there is something in their character, perhaps by the condition in which they find themselves, whether it is because of some unfortunate lack of ability, or because of some unfortunate probability of circumstance that one finds himself in a state of poverty. The poor are afforded at least a certain perspective to understand what it means to go without. And I think, just like many things in the Proverbs, there are two sides to this coin. To go without, I think, can be seen as a positive as well as a negative. In the first instance, if one is to go without, I think they may appreciate what it means to have, more so than one that has or always has had or has been born into a state of having material goods. Conversely, one that is in a state of not having or in a state of poverty, I think is susceptible to the desires of those that do have. I think this can lead to many different things. Jealousy is one of them. That would be more of a negative thing. Drive, motivation can be another, which is a positive thing. Can be a positive thing. In a state of not having, one can be worn down by that experience, depending on the degree of that privation. So whether this creates a state of thankfulness and humility, or a state of jealousy and profound longing, I think that we have to keep both sides of this coin in mind when we think of the poor. Now the first part of this verse, it says much food. It implies abundance. And the tillage obviously is as much a physical agricultural analogy as it is to a principled way of seeing the world, of looking towards the future, of paying attention to the substrate by which the seed will grow in, to take care of one's livelihood. And I think that what this implies here, if we are to look at the positive side of the coin that embodies this poor person, I think what we see here is a message of diligence and of usefulness, utility, efficiency, to use the resources that one may have, although it may be limited, to produce, just to produce, to effectively manage. And through effective management, abundance will come. And in fact, this verse, at least the beginning of this verse, almost seems contradictory. We have much food and then we have poor. And you would think the person that lives in a state of abundance surely would not be considered poor. But of course there's more to poverty than just having enough food to eat, I suppose. Now the second half of this verse is where I think it becomes interesting. More interesting. But there is that is destroyed for want of judgment. Now the first time I read it, I tripped up my words because it doesn't seem like it's correct. But there is that is destroyed for want of judgment. It seems like an incorrect word usage there. But there is. Let's start with that. Now this is a foundational statement. To say something that is to say something exists. Is to identify something, to place a boundary around something. Just as I said, to identify it, to give it an identity. To establish a relationship with something in the mind, so that we are consciously aware of it. But there is that is destroyed for want of judgment. So once we form this relationship, we've identified something and placed a boundary around it, we have come into communion with this part of the external environment. It's possible that it will be destroyed for this desire of judgment. Now what possibly could that mean? And why would it be so? In what case would we want judgment? And how is this related to the first part of the verse? Well, in the epistemological sense, the want of judgment, I think, is the want on the part of a man to know what is true, to know what is certain. And it's interesting when it says, but there is something that is certain in the first part of that verse is destroyed for want of judgment. Now how is it destroyed? Now surely the want of judgment would allow us to more accurately identify that which is, to give a more accurate account to our judgments, to be much more secure. But perhaps it's suggesting that there is this desire, such as the desire on the other side of that coin of poverty, that leads to jealousy. More of the detracting effect of the stricken and the impoverished. The desire and that wanting. Again, the jealousy. I think it can lead to a perversion of one's judgment. And that instead of following a principle of attentiveness and of carefulness, surely there's a more sophisticated word in here. Perhaps conscientiousness or industriousness. Instead of these genuine qualities, the want of judgment or the want of understanding of what to do leads one to take all sorts of shortcuts, to find themselves in a delusion of mind that would suggest that there is a much easier road, that by some magical experience or miracle, they can have all the abundance and the riches of heaven without having to do the groundwork, without having to be as attentive as is necessary. And I think attentiveness it can be quite difficult work. It's a lot of trial and error. It's a lot of patience. It's a lot of humility. And without that which is known, that which has some relation to a society, to an individual, to a small community, can be destroyed by this rampant desire for more. And not just more, but more faster, but more now, more based on the desires of the heart and the selfishness of the being, of the person that is. And so what little the poor do have in this scenario, it can be destroyed by this rampant desire. This reminds me of the Epic of Gilgamesh. After Gilgamesh's best friend and companion dies, he is set into this downward spiral, an existential crisis. On one hand, he loses his friend, and on the other, he is unable to justify death. And he leaves and he goes on to this wild pursuit, which drains him, damages his body, and makes him aggressive. And his wild, rash, unconscientious behavior leads him farther from that goal that he is after. He's after this immortality. He's after answers to the questions that plague him. But he can't get to it because of that aggression, because of the fire in the heart that won't let him be. And this lack of stability seems to undo him. In the words of the epic, his hands get in his own way. They are his undoing. He that spares his rod hates his son, but he that loves him chasteneth him betimes. So this verse requires some unpacking. So to begin with the first part, he that spares his rod hates his son. So there's something within the symbol of the rod that is fundamental to this verse. It's as though if he had used it instead of keeping it, sparing it for some later purpose, this hatred for his son would not be. And so how could it be that the using of a rod would lead to the opposite of this behavior, to the love of one's son? It's possible that the rod is this representation of discipline, of authority. Now, if we keep discipline and authority back, we spare it from use. The son will grow wildly, like a weed grows. It'll take up viable soil for which more fruitful plants would otherwise have room to grow. And so in this way, think it is warning us that although the using of the rod may be displeasing, or it may be fatiguing, probably a better way to see it, it may be fatiguing to figure out exactly what to do in certain situations, about why one should discipline in a certain way and for what purpose. But in its absence, it can create or allow an unfettered growth. A monster can emerge in which the bond between this familial bond that is has some of the strongest potential for love has now been perverted and decayed and rotten. It has melted away into hatred. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have the second half of the verse. But he that loves him chasteneth him betimes. Now, betimes means before the expected time or early. Now, to chasteneth is to chasten, is to give, is to provide moderation. It is to rebuke. It is to, in this context, to moderate, to teach lessons, to maintain that authority that the rod symbolizes. And so that love is facilitated by early discipline, by early authority, by early moderation of the child, so that the child can be directed and grow as he or she ought to grow. Moreover, from that, this relationship develops more strongly, more firmly, because of these authoritative actions and the principles that are instilled therein. The righteous eateth to the satisfying of his soul, but the belly of the wicked shall want. Now this is the last verse of chapter 13. It is implying that those who desire good eat in such a way, not for indulgence. There's a certain type of eating and indulgence that has a physical connotation to it, but of course it's a metaphor. For the soul is not the stomach. The soul is an ethereal thing. It is a part of us that experiences the world. It is a part of us that is our most fundamental qualities and characteristics. The identity, the will, all of this is bound up, I think, within the soul. Now, to satisfy the soul is not to say, in parallel to the superficial satisfaction that one gets from eating, let's say, an ice cream cone or injecting heroin. Let's say two seemingly dissimilar examples, but fairly similar given enough consideration. And that is to say, both behaviors are not all that healthy for the body, nor are they healthy for the mind, but they do have effects on the mind as they do the body. And the reason that we engage in them is, to a degree, spiritual. It is to cover a spiritual lack, to cover a hole in our core of who we are, in the soul. The thing that understands, the self-aware thing that is able to think of its own self and existence, to reflect on it. When it says the righteous eateth to satisfy this thing, it means to genuinely satisfy it. It means that the soul is unburdened by those types of satisfaction that are lowly. The depth and breadth of this thing that we call the soul is expansive. It is full of love. But the belly of the wicked shall want is just the opposite. Those that are overly indulgent in the deception of the self they see not of the things outside of their own will, let's say, of their own desires. And because they are blinded by their own selfishness, they are unable to accept that which is truly nourishing, and that which they use to attempt to satisfy them are these superficial things. A quick fix, like that of the drug addict, or that of the obese person. So this concludes chapter 13. We will continue next time with chapter 14 in Proverbs.